The sun sets over the small working-class neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold as Marcos López, a single father and mechanic, secures the last sheet of metal in the makeshift workshop that keeps his late father's dream alive. At his side, little 6-year-old Isabela seems to carry in her eyes the wisdom of someone who has already faced loss. Her tiny hands clutch the yellowed photograph of her grandfather, a timeless reminder that, despite everything, there is hope. Yet a new morning brings a biting cold that accompanies the whisper of news. A woman has fallen into the neighborhood's glacial lake. Without hesitation, Marcos races to save her life, but the mist hides a secret that will change his fate forever. When he emerges from the water, carrying the stranger to shore, his fingers tremble as they brush against a gleaming object on her wrist, an exceptionally rare diamond watch, a striking contrast to the hero's calloused hand. She opens her eyes, gasping for breath, and in a steady whisper says, "You have no idea who I am." His heart pounds. As the camera pulls back, we see a small gold plate on the watch etched with a name, Aurora Van der Holt. And then, a burst of intrigue. Why was this billionaire heiress alone in that icy lake? Subscribe to find out how far love can cross social divides. The metallic symphony of worn wrenches against rusted bolts filled the cramped garage as Marcos Rodriguez wrestled with the stubborn engine of a 1987 Buick LeSabre. Oil-stained fingers gripped the tools with the desperation of a man who knew that every turn of the wrench meant another dollar closer to keeping the lights on. The pungent aroma of motor oil hung thick in the air, a familiar perfume that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. "Daddy, look what I made." Isabela's voice cut through the mechanical chorus, sweet and innocent as morning dew on summer grass. Marcos wiped his hands on the greasy rag tucked into his belt and turned toward his 8-year-old daughter, who sat perched in her small wheelchair beside the workbench. Her dark eyes sparkled with the kind of hope that only children possess, the kind that believes in magic even when the world seems determined to prove otherwise. In her small hands, she held up a drawing created with well-worn crayons, their tips rounded from countless hours of use. The artwork showed 3 figures standing together beneath a crudely drawn sun: a tall man with kind eyes, an elderly gentleman with a proud smile, and a little girl with pigtails. Above them, in Isabela's careful handwriting, were the words "Mi Familia." "It's beautiful, Mija," Marcos said, his voice thick with emotion as he crouched down to her level. The drawing transported him back to better times, when his grandfather's booming laugh filled this very garage, when hope wasn't such a rare commodity in the Rodriguez household. Behind Isabela, tacked to the wall with a bent nail, hung a faded photograph of his grandfather, Abuelo Miguel. The old man's hands were permanently stained with grease, his knuckles scarred from decades of honest work, but his smile radiated the kind of pride that came from building something with your own 2 hands. Those same hands had taught Marcos everything he knew about engines, about life, about being a man who faced his problems head-on. "Daddy," Isabela's voice grew softer, more tentative. "Mrs. Garcia from the corner store, she said we haven't paid for the milk in 2 weeks." The words hit Marcos like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that the world is harder than it should be? That sometimes, no matter how hard you work, the bills pile up faster than the money comes in? "I know, baby girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent light that flickered overhead. "Daddy's working on it." Isabela reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of chocolate wrapped in crinkled foil. "I saved this from Christmas," she said, offering it to him with a smile that could have powered the entire neighborhood. Abuelo always said chocolate makes everything better. The memory of his grandfather's Christmas tradition, hot chocolate on Christmas Eve, no matter how tight money was, nearly broke him. Miguel Rodriguez had been a man who believed that love and family were the only riches that truly mattered. If only love could pay the electric bill. As Marcos unwrapped the chocolate, a gust of wind from the open garage door scattered the papers on his workbench. Among the invoices and receipts, a forgotten bill caught his eye, a notice from the bank about the mortgage. Past due. Final warning. The words blurred together as panic clawed at his chest. Outside, the modest neighborhood of East Side hummed with the quiet dignity of working-class families. Faded vinyl siding and chain-link fences couldn't diminish the sense of community that bound these streets together. Mrs. Morales waved from her front porch, where she sat watching her grandchildren play in the dying light of day. Old Mr. Thompson nodded from his garden, his weathered hands tending to tomatoes that somehow managed to thrive despite the concrete jungle around them. "Daddy." Isabella's voice pulled him back to the present. "Do you think Abuelo would help us if he was still here?" The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with meaning and memory. Marcos looked at his daughter, so brave, so full of faith despite everything life had thrown at them since her mother's death 3 years ago. The car accident that had taken Elena and left Isabela with legs that would never carry her again had also taken something from Marcos that he wasn't sure he'd ever get back. "He's helping us right now, Mija," Marcos said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his heart. "Every time I fix a car, every time I remember what he taught me, he's right here with us." The memory washed over him like a tide, Abuelo Miguel's patient hands guiding his young fingers as they worked together on brake pads. "A man provides for his family, Marcos," the old man had said. "Not because it's easy, but because it's right. You find a way, even when there seems to be no way." The shrill ring of Marcos's cell phone shattered the moment. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but desperation made him answer anyway. "Rodriguez Auto Repair," he said, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "Yeah, I got your number from Jorge Martinez." The voice on the other end was urgent, almost frantic. "I need emergency roadside assistance. My car broke down near Crystal Lake. I can pay cash, good money, if you can get here tonight." Marcos glanced at Isabela, who had dozed off in her wheelchair, her drawing clutched against her chest. The thought of leaving her alone, even for a few hours, made his stomach churn. But the promise of cash, real money that could keep the lights on for another month, was too tempting to ignore. The voice of his late wife seemed to whisper in his ear, as it often did in moments of crisis, "Protect the ones you love, Marcos. Do whatever it takes." Elena's words had become his mantra in the 3 years since her death. Every decision, every sacrifice, every moment of despair had been filtered through that simple commandment. Protect Isabela. Keep her safe. Give her the life she deserved, even if it meant working himself to the bone. Marcos walked to the wall where his grandfather's photo hung, weathered fingers tracing the frame, as he had done countless times before. "Give me strength, Abuelo," he whispered. "Help me find a way." The evening air carried the first hints of the cold front that the weather forecast had promised. Marcos shivered as he grabbed his keys and the heavy wool jacket that had belonged to his grandfather, the one that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and Old Spice. As he prepared to leave, Isabela stirred in her wheelchair, her eyes fluttering open. With sleepy movements, she tore a piece of paper from her drawing pad and wrote in careful letters, "Buena suerte, Daddy." The simple words, "Good luck," hit him harder than any sermon, any pep talk, any desperate prayer. He knelt down and kissed her forehead, tasting the salt of tears he didn't realize he'd been crying. "I'll be back soon, baby girl," he promised, wrapping her in the quilt Elena had made during her pregnancy. "Uncle Jose will check on you, okay?" As if summoned by his words, their neighbor Jose appeared in the doorway, his kind face creased with concern. "Go do what you need to do, hermano," he said, placing a comforting hand on Marcos' shoulder. "Isabela's in good hands." The old clock on the wall, another relic from his grandfather's time, ticked steadily, marking the passage of seconds, minutes, hours. Time had become Marcos' enemy, always moving too fast when he needed it to slow down, too slow when he needed it to speed up. But tonight, time felt different. Tonight, it felt like destiny. Marcos climbed into his battered van, the engine coughing to life with a sound that would have made his grandfather proud. As he pulled out of the driveway, his heart heavy with apprehension and hope in equal measure, he had no idea that this emergency call would change everything. The road to Crystal Lake stretched ahead of him, dark and full of possibilities he couldn't yet imagine. Crystal Lake stretched before Marcos like a mirror reflecting the crescent moon, its glassy surface deceptively calm under the star-studded sky. The water appeared peaceful, almost inviting, but he knew better than to trust appearances. Lakes like this one held secrets in their depths, secrets that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. The distant wail of sirens pierced the silence of the sleeping neighborhood, their mournful cry echoing off the water like the lament of some ancient spirit. Red and blue lights painted the trees in hellish hues, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with malevolent intent. Marcos felt his pulse quicken as he approached the scene, his grandfather's heavy coat pulling tight across his shoulders. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing tire tracks in the soft earth near the water's edge. Fresh tracks. Someone had been here recently, and judging by the deep grooves, they'd been in a hurry. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain, and something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Then he heard it, a muffled cry, desperate and fading, coming from somewhere beneath the surface. The sound was barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, but it was unmistakably human, unmistakably terrified. Dios mío. Marcos breathed, his flashlight beam dancing frantically across the water's surface. Without a second thought, he dropped the flashlight and dove into the lake, his grandfather's coat trailing behind him like a shroud. The shock of the cold water hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs in a violent gasp. Ice-cold needles pierced his skin as he fought against the lake's embrace, every nerve ending screaming in protest. But Marcos Rodriguez was not a man who gave up easily. The same hands that had learned to work miracles with broken engines now worked miracles of their own, cutting through the water with powerful strokes that would have made his grandfather proud. Tangled weeds and submerged branches clawed at his clothes, trying to drag him down to join whatever secrets lay buried in the lake's murky depths. His lungs burned with the effort, but he pushed deeper, following the sound of struggle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The darkness was absolute here, a living thing that pressed against his eyes and filled his mouth with the taste of decay and desperation. Then, in the swirling chaos of water and shadow, he saw her. A woman, her long hair floating around her like a dark halo, her elegant dress billowing in the current. She moved with the grace of a dancer even in her distress, her arms reaching upward toward a surface that seemed impossibly far away. There was something ethereal about her, something that didn't belong in this working-class corner of the world. Marcos wrapped his arms around her waist and kicked upward, his muscles screaming in protest as he fought against the water's relentless pull. The surface seemed to mock them, always just out of reach, but he refused to give up. Not when a life hung in the balance. Not when his grandfather's voice echoed in his mind, "A man saves who he can save, Marcos." It's what separates us from the animals. They broke through the surface together, gasping and choking as the night air filled their lungs. The woman Aurora, though he didn't know her name yet, was pale as moonlight, her skin translucent in the darkness. Her eyes, when they finally focused on his face, held a depth of confusion and something else. Fear? Gratitude? It was impossible to tell. You saved me," she whispered, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who had never known the rough edges of poverty. "But who are you?" Before Marcos could answer, he heard another voice calling from the shore. Isabela's voice, high and frightened, cutting through the night like a blade. "Daddy, Daddy, what happened?" He turned to see his daughter's wheelchair at the water's edge, Jose standing behind her with his hands on her shoulders. The old man's face was creased with worry, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from seeing too much life, too much loss. "It's okay, Mija," Marcos called out, his voice hoarse from the cold water. "Everything's going to be okay." But as he helped Aurora toward the shore, He wondered if that was true. There was something about this woman, something that didn't fit with the normal rhythm of his life. She clung to his wrist with surprising strength, her fingers like ice against his skin, and in her eyes he saw a confusion that went beyond the shock of nearly drowning. "Here," he said, shrugging out of his grandfather's coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. The expensive silk of her dress clung to her body like a second skin, and even soaked through, it spoke of a world far removed from his own. This should help. Aurora pulled the coat tighter around herself, and for a moment, the only sounds were their ragged breathing and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. But Marcos noticed other things too, the subtle scent of her perfume, something French and expensive that lingered even after her dunking in the lake. The glint of what looked like a very expensive watch on her wrist, its face catching the moonlight like a diamond. She was trying to hide it, he realized. The signs of wealth, the markers of a life lived far above his station. But poverty had taught Marcos to recognize luxury when he saw it, and this woman was luxury personified. "You're not from around here," he said, and it wasn't a question. Aurora's smile was enigmatic, mysterious in a way that made his heart race for reasons he couldn't quite understand. "No," she said simply. "I'm not." There was something in her voice, a loneliness that resonated with his own. Despite the obvious differences in their circumstances, Marcos recognized the sound of someone who had been carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. "Don't tell anyone about me," Aurora said suddenly, her voice taking on an urgent quality. "Please. It's complicated." Marcos hesitated. In a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, keeping secrets was a luxury most people couldn't afford. But there was something in her eyes, a vulnerability that reminded him of Isabela when she'd first woken up in the hospital and realized her legs would never work again. "I won't," he said, and meant it. That's when they heard it, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the night air. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and suddenly the lake was bathed in the harsh glare of spotlights. The aircraft circled overhead like a mechanical vulture, its searchlights sweeping across the water in systematic patterns. Aurora tensed beside him, her grip on his wrist tightening. "They're looking for me," she whispered, and there was something in her voice that might have been fear. Or relief. It was impossible to tell. The helicopter's lights found them, pinning them in place like insects under a microscope. Aurora raised her hand to shield her eyes, and in that moment, Marcos saw something that made his breath catch. Despite the fear, despite the confusion, despite everything that had happened, she was smiling. But was the saddest smile he'd ever seen. "Senora," Isabela's voice carried across the water, innocent and curious. "Are you okay?" Aurora turned toward the little girl, and something in her expression softened. For just a moment, the mask of sophistication slipped, and Marcos saw the woman beneath, lonely, frightened, and utterly alone despite whatever wealth and privilege surrounded her. "I'm okay now, little one," Aurora said, her voice gentle. "Thanks to your father." The two of them locked eyes across the distance, the billionaire heiress and the little girl in the wheelchair, and in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps. A recognition of kindred spirits who had both learned that the world could be a cruel and unpredictable place. As the helicopter circled overhead and the sirens grew louder, Marcos realized that Aurora Van der Holt, though he still didn't know her name, had no address to give him. No place to go. No one to call. She was, in every way that mattered, as lost as he was. The night was far from over, and already, Marcos Rodriguez knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The Van der Holt mansion stood like a monument to power and privilege, its towering columns and endless corridors speaking of a world where money could buy everything except the one thing Aurora craved most: peace. Italian marble floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, while priceless artwork adorned walls that had never known the scuff marks of poverty or the fingerprints of desperate hands. Aurora sat curled in an antique velvet armchair that cost more than most people's yearly salary, her legs drawn up beneath her like a child seeking comfort. The designer dress she'd worn to the lake had been replaced by silk pajamas that whispered against her skin, but she still felt the phantom chill of the water, still tasted the metallic fear that had filled her mouth as she'd sunk beneath the surface. Her platinum watch, a gift from her father on her 18th birthday, caught the light as she turned her wrist, its diamonds winking like captured stars. 2 hours had passed since the rescue, but time moved differently in this gilded cage. Minutes stretched into eternities when you had everything money could buy and nothing that money couldn't. Miss Van der Holt came the clipped, efficient voice of Margaret Whitman, the family's attorney and Aurora's self-appointed guardian angel. The woman's silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her charcoal suit impeccable despite the late hour. "I need to know everything about this, savior of yours." Aurora's fingers tightened on the armrest. "His name is Marcos. That's all I know." "That's not enough," Whitman snapped, her briefcase clicking open with the precision of a trap. "We need full background checks, financial records, family history. Someone who would dive into a lake to save a stranger either has ulterior motives or is dangerously naive." The memory hit Aurora like a physical blow, herself at 7 years old, standing at the edge of the family pool while her father held out his arms. "Trust me, little star," he'd said, his voice warm with love and patience. "I'll never let you drown." But she'd been so afraid, so terrified of the water closing over her head, of losing control, of depending on someone else to save her. Irony had a cruel sense of humor. "I don't want any publicity," Aurora said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to command respect despite her youth. "No press releases, no interviews, no hero stories. Nothing." Whitman's laugh was sharp and calculating. "My dear, you're worth $3 billion. You can't sneeze without someone wanting to write about it. But don't worry, I control the narrative. I always have." The attorney pulled out her phone, fingers flying over the screen as she began the process of damage control. Within minutes, she would have private investigators digging into Marcos Rodriguez's life, reporters being fed carefully crafted stories, and the truth being buried under layers of legal protection and media manipulation. Aurora closed her eyes, remembering the day her father had died. The massive heart attack had taken him in his sleep, leaving her alone in a world that suddenly felt too big, too empty, too cold. She'd been 18 then, thrust into a position of power she'd never wanted, surrounded by people who saw her as a walking bank account rather than a grieving daughter. "Security will be tripled," Whitman continued, her voice cutting through Aurora's memories like a blade. "I'm installing additional cameras around the property, and you'll have a bodyguard escort for all public appearances. We can't have you wandering off again." "I wasn't wandering," Aurora protested, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was, she'd been driving aimlessly that night, trying to escape the suffocating weight of her inheritance, when the car had skidded on the wet road and plunged into the lake. She'd thought, for just a moment, that maybe this was how it would end. Maybe the water would finally give her the peace that money never could. But then strong arms had wrapped around her, and a voice had whispered reassurances in her ear, and she'd found herself looking into the eyes of a man who'd risked everything to save someone he didn't even know. Meanwhile, across town, the local news station was preparing its morning broadcast. The assignment editor, a thin man with nervous energy and coffee-stained fingers, was already crafting the story. Mysterious heiress rescued from lake. Who was her hero? The contrast between the two worlds couldn't have been starker. While Aurora sat in her mansion, surrounded by luxury and isolation, Marcos returned to his modest home where Isabela waited with the kind of unconditional love that no amount of money could buy. "Daddy," she cried, launching herself from her wheelchair into his arms with the fearless trust of a child who knew her father would always catch her. "You're freezing, and you smell like the lake." Marcos held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and the lingering sweetness of the chocolate she'd shared with him earlier. "I'm okay, Mija," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Just had to help someone who needed it." "Were you scared?" Isabela asked, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. "Terrified," Marcos admitted, settling into the worn couch with his daughter still in his arms. But sometimes being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared. "Like when I had to learn to use my wheelchair?" she asked, and the simple question nearly broke his heart. "Exactly like that, baby girl. You're the bravest person I know." As they talked, Marcos carefully hung his grandfather's coat by the heater to dry, trying not to think about the risks he'd taken. What if he'd drowned? What if he'd left Isabela alone in the world? The thought made his hands shake as he prepared their simple dinner of canned soup and day-old bread. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while images of dark water and desperate eyes played behind his closed lids. Who was the woman he'd saved? Why had she been so insistent that he tell no one about her? And why did her sadness feel so familiar, so much like his own? Miles away, in her ivory tower, Aurora sat at an antique writing desk, her gold fountain pen moving across the pages of a leather-bound journal. "Dear Diary," she wrote, the words feeling childish but necessary. "Today I met someone who saved my life and asked for nothing in return. I don't know his last name, don't know if he has a family, don't know anything about him except that he has kind eyes and strong hands, and he didn't hesitate to risk everything for a stranger. I feel grateful and guilty in equal measure. Grateful to be alive, guilty that my rescue will probably ruin his life once Margaret gets through with her investigations." The next morning brought the inevitable media circus. Reporters camped outside the Van der Holt estate, their cameras and microphones ready to capture any glimpse of the mysterious heiress who had nearly drowned. Whitman held court in the marble-floored foyer, her voice sharp and authoritative as she fielded calls from journalists hungry for the story. "We're particularly interested in the hero angle," one reporter pressed. "A working-class man saves a billionaire heiress. It's a modern fairy tale." Whitman's smile was cold as winter steel. "I'm sure it is. But Miss Van der Holt values her privacy above all else." It was then that Aurora made her decision. Using a secure phone that Whitman didn't know about, she sent a text to the number she'd memorized from Marcos's business card. "This is Aurora, the woman from the lake. We need to talk. Can you meet me at Rosie's Diner on 5th Street at noon? Please come alone." Marcos stared at the message for a long time, his calloused fingers tracing the letters on the screen. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend that the previous night had been a dream. But another part, the part that had inherited his grandfather's sense of honor, knew he couldn't turn away from someone who needed help. "I'll be there," he typed back, then immediately regretted it. At the diner, the contrast between their worlds was stark and undeniable. Aurora wore a simple black dress that probably cost more than Marcos made in a year, her only jewelry a delicate gold necklace that caught the light like captured sunlight. Marcos sat across from her in his work clothes, his hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. But despite the differences in their circumstances, there was something in her eyes that he recognized, the same bone-deep weariness that he saw in his own reflection every morning. Back at home, Isabela had spent the morning creating a new drawing with her crayons. This one showed a man and a woman standing by a lake, both of them smiling. Above them, in her careful 8-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "Daddy and the Lake Lady, heroes help each other." That night, in the silence of her mansion, Aurora fell asleep clutching a small teddy bear that had somehow found its way to her nightstand. It was worn and well-loved, with button eyes and a red ribbon around its neck. She didn't know that Isabela had pressed it into her father's hands before he left for the diner, with instructions to give it to the sad lady so she wouldn't be alone. Two worlds, separated by circumstance but connected by something deeper than money or status. Something that neither of them fully understood yet, but both of them desperately needed: hope. Rosie's Diner was a temple to working-class America, where wrought iron chairs bore the scars of countless conversations, and the aroma of fresh-baked bread mingled with the robust scent of coffee that had been brewing since dawn. The worn linoleum floors and mismatched tables spoke of a place where substance mattered more than style, where the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and the pie was made with love instead of profit margins. Into this sanctuary of simplicity came Aurora Van der Holt, her arrival as jarring as a diamond in a coal mine. The black sedan that deposited her at the curb gleamed like a predator among the rusted pickups and economical compacts that usually grace the diner's parking lot. 2 security guards flanked her, their dark suits and earpieces marking them as foreign invaders in this realm of flannel shirts and honest calluses. Aurora moved through the diner like a ghost trying to find her way home, her designer dress a stark contrast to the blue-collar uniforms and thrift store clothing that surrounded her. She chose a table by the window, its red vinyl seat cracked with age, but clean with the kind of cleanliness that came from pride rather than professional service. Marcos arrived 10 minutes later, and Aurora's breath caught in her throat. He carried Isabela in his arms, the little girl's face bright with excitement as she clutched a folded piece of paper to her chest. The sight of them together, father and daughter united in their simple, unshakable love, made something deep inside Aurora's chest ache with longing. "Señora," Isabela called out, her voice cutting through the diner's morning bustle like a bell. "I made you something." She thrust the paper toward Aurora with the enthusiasm of a child who believed that art could heal the world. The drawing showed a woman with long, dark hair standing beside a lake, but this version was surrounded by flowers and butterflies with a bright sun shining overhead. At the bottom, in careful crayon letters, were the words, "For the pretty lady who needs friends." Aurora took the drawing with trembling hands, her carefully constructed composure cracking like ice in spring. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're very talented." "Daddy says art comes from the heart," Isabela said proudly, settling into her wheelchair beside the table. "And my heart wanted to make you happy." The diner's owner, a burly man named Tony, who'd been serving the neighborhood for 30 years, approached their table with the kind of smile reserved for children and angels. "What can I get you folks?" he asked, but his eyes were fixed on Isabela, who was arranging her crayons with the seriousness of a surgeon preparing for operation. "Hot chocolate for the little princess," Tony decided before anyone could answer. "Extra marshmallows on the house. And you, miss?" He turned to Aurora with the kind of respectful curiosity that came from a lifetime of serving people from all walks of life. "Coffee, please," Aurora said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Black. You sure about that?" Tony asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "You look like you could use some sweetening up." Across the diner, Mrs. Elena Vasquez, the grandmother of one of Marcos's regular customers, watched the unlikely trio with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen 8 decades of human drama. She raised her coffee cup in a subtle salute, her wrinkled face breaking into a smile that spoke of solidarity and understanding. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Aurora said once Tony had departed. "About not telling anyone about me. I want to thank you properly." Marcos shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "No need for thanks. Any decent person would have done the same." "But that's just it," Aurora said, her voice gaining strength. "Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have thought about the risks, about their own families, about what they had to lose. You didn't hesitate." "I had everything to lose," Marcos said quietly, his eyes finding Isabela, who was coloring contentedly beside them. "That's exactly why I couldn't let you drown." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Aurora studied his face, seeing the lines of worry and exhaustion that no amount of money could erase from her own mirror. "What is enough?" she asked suddenly. "When you have so little, what makes you feel like you have enough?" Marcos was quiet for a long moment, his calloused hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "When Isabela smiles," he said finally. "When she draws me a picture or tells me about her day or falls asleep in my arms. When my neighbors wave at me from their porches. When I fix someone's car and they can get to work another day. That's enough." "I have $3 billion, Aurora said, her voice barely audible. And I can't remember the last time I felt like I had enough of anything that mattered." Behind them, the two security guards shifted uncomfortably, their training at odds with the intimate nature of the conversation they were witnessing. One of them spoke quietly into his earpiece, probably reporting to Margaret Whitman that the situation was under control, but his eyes kept drifting to Isabela, who was humming softly as she worked on another drawing. "My father used to say that money was a tool," Aurora continued, her voice growing stronger. "But I think somewhere along the way, it became a prison. The more you have, the more afraid you become of losing it, of people wanting to take it from you, of never knowing if someone loves you or your bank account. My grandfather used to say that a man's wealth was measured by what he left behind," Marcos said. "Not money or property, but the impact he had on the people around him. The lives he touched, the good he did. That's the only inheritance that really matters." Aurora's eyes filled with tears that she fought to control. "Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man." "He was the best man I've ever known," Marcos said simply. "He would have liked you." "How can you say that? You don't even know me." "I know you're sitting in a diner with a man who has grease under his fingernails and a little girl who thinks crayons are magic. I know you're not afraid to get your expensive dress dirty. I know you cry when someone gives you a drawing. That tells me everything I need to know." Just then, the diner's door burst open with a violence that shattered the peaceful morning atmosphere. A young man in an expensive suit strode in, his eyes scanning the room with the predatory intensity of a hunter. Aurora's face went pale as she recognized him. "Cousin Richard," she breathed, her voice filled with dread. Richard Van der Holt III was everything Aurora despised about her family's legacy: ambitious, ruthless, and utterly without shame. He'd been circling her inheritance like a vulture since her father's death, waiting for any sign of weakness, any opportunity to claim what he believed was rightfully his. "There you are, Aurora," he said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a politician. "Margaret's been looking everywhere for you. You can't just disappear like that. The board is concerned about your stability." He pulled out his phone, snapping pictures of the scene before anyone could react. "This is perfect," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Poor little rich girl, slumming it with the locals. The board will love this." "Put that away," Aurora said, her voice sharp with authority. "Now." "I don't think so," Richard said, continuing to photograph. "The media's going to have a field day with this. Billionaire Heiress has breakdown, abandons responsibilities. It practically writes itself." That's when they heard the sirens, not the distant wail of emergency vehicles, but the closer, more urgent sound of news vans racing through the narrow streets of the neighborhood. Someone had tipped off the press, and they were coming. Marcos stood up, his body instinctively moving to shield Aurora from the chaos that was about to descend upon them. "We need to go," he said quietly. "Now." "You're not going anywhere," Richard said, his voice turning ugly. "This is exactly what the family needs, proof that you're unfit to handle the Van der Holt fortune." But before he could say another word, Isabela's small voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Why are you being mean to our friend?" she asked, her dark eyes fixed on Richard with the kind of innocent directness that could make grown men ashamed of themselves. Richard faltered, his carefully constructed arrogance cracking in the face of a child's simple question. She's not your friend, little girl. She's way out of your league." "My daddy says everyone's in the same league when it comes to being kind," Isabela said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that strength came from the heart, not the wallet. Aurora stood up slowly, her entire demeanor changing as she faced her cousin. The vulnerability that had marked her conversation with Marcos was gone, replaced by the steel that had been forged in boardrooms and shareholder meetings. "Richard," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who controlled billions of dollars, "you will put your phone away, you will leave this diner, and you will not breathe a word of this to anyone. Is that understood?" "You can't," Richard began, but Aurora cut him off. "I can, and I will. One phone call from me, and your trust fund disappears. One word from me, and your country club membership is revoked. One signature from me, and your comfortable life ends. Are we clear? Richard's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, but he slowly lowered his phone. "This isn't over, Aurora." "Yes, it is," she said simply. As Richard stormed out of the diner, Aurora turned to Marcos and Isabela, her expression softening. "I'm sorry about that," she said. "My family, they're complicated." "All families are complicated," Marcos said gently. "But you handled that like a warrior." Aurora smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in months. "I learned from the best," she said, looking at Isabela. "Your daughter taught me that sometimes you have to stand up to the bullies." Outside, the sirens were getting closer, but Aurora made no move to leave. Instead, she turned off her phone with a decisive click and sat back down at the table. "I'm not ready to go back to that world yet," she said. "If that's okay with you." Marcos looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "It's okay with us." Together, they sat in the diner, surrounded by the curious stares of the other customers, but warmed by something more valuable than money, the simple human connection that comes from sharing coffee and conversation with people who see past the surface to the heart beneath. Outside, the world of media and money and manipulation waited, but inside Rosie's diner, three unlikely friends had found something that no amount of wealth could buy: belonging. The invitation came with the innocent enthusiasm that only children possess, delivered through eyes that sparkled with the kind of joy that could melt even the coldest hearts. "Senora Aurora," Isabela said, her small hands clasped together as if in prayer, "would you like to see where Daddy works magic? He can make broken things whole again." Aurora's breath caught in her throat. It had been 3 days since the confrontation at the diner, 3 days of hiding in her mansion, while Margaret Whitman fielded calls from reporters and Richard continued his campaign to undermine her competency. But here was this beautiful child, offering her something no amount of money could buy: genuine friendship without agenda. "I would love that," Aurora said, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite hide. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Aurora stood before her wall-to-wall closet, staring at designer dresses that cost more than most people's rent, and made a decision that would have shocked her social circle. She chose a simple navy cardigan, the most modest piece of clothing she owned, and jeans that had never been worn because they were too casual for someone of her station. As she walked toward the Rodriguez auto repair shop, Aurora felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of expectation, of constant judgment, of living up to an impossible standard seemed to lift with each step away from her gilded cage. The garage was a cathedral of honest work, where tools hung on pegboards like religious artifacts, and the smell of motor oil was incense to the gods of persistence and ingenuity. Marcos looked up from the engine. He was rebuilding, his face breaking into a smile that could have powered the entire neighborhood. "You came," he said, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone like Aurora would choose to spend her weekend in a place like this. "I promised," Aurora said simply, and those 2 words carried more weight than any contract she'd ever signed. Isabela wheeled herself between them, her face glowing with the excitement of a child who was about to share her most precious treasure. "Daddy, show her how you fix the hearts of cars." Marcos chuckled, his calloused hands moving with the precision of a surgeon as he explained each component of the engine. "This is the carburetor," he said, his voice carrying the same reverence a priest might use when describing the mysteries of faith. "It mixes air and fuel, gives the engine life. Without it, all you have is expensive metal." Aurora watched mesmerized as his hands moved with practiced confidence. When he gestured for her to touch a particular part, she hesitated only a moment before placing her manicured fingers beside his grease-stained ones. The contact sent electricity through her entire body, and she found herself laughing, a sound so pure and unexpected that it surprised even her. "I've never touched anything this real," she admitted, looking at the dark smudges now decorating her pale skin. "Everything in my world is so sanitized." "Real things get dirty," Marcos said gently. "That's how you know they're alive." The sound of footsteps on the gravel outside announced the arrival of Dona Rosa, the neighborhood's unofficial grandmother, carrying a plate covered with a clean kitchen towel. The elderly woman's face was weathered by decades of hard work and harder choices, but her eyes held the kind of warmth that could heal broken spirits. "I brought empanadas," she announced, setting the plate on a workbench with the ceremony of someone presenting a crown jewel. Fresh from the oven, made with love and a little prayer. Aurora accepted the golden pastry with trembling hands, as if she were holding something sacred. She took a bite and closed her eyes, tasting not just the seasoned beef and tender dough, but the care that had gone into every fold, every crimp of the crust. "This is incredible," she whispered, and Dona Rosa beamed with pride. "The secret ingredient is not in the recipe," the old woman said, tapping her chest with a gnarled finger. "It's in here. Love makes everything taste better." As the afternoon faded into evening, Aurora found herself drawn to the wall where old photographs hung like windows into the past. The largest showed a man with kind eyes and proud shoulders, his hands blackened with honest work, his smile radiant with the satisfaction of a life well lived. "That's my grandfather," Marcos said, joining her at the wall. "Miguel Rodriguez. He built this place with his own hands, one tool at a time." "He looks like he was happy," Aurora observed, studying the photograph with the intensity of an art critic examining a masterpiece. "He was," Marcos said. "He used to say that happiness wasn't something you found, it was something you built piece by piece, day by day. Like an engine. You put in the work, and eventually it runs." "What kind of heritage is that?" Aurora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The kind you can't buy with money?" "The only kind that matters," Marcos replied. "The kind that survives you, that lives on in the people you touch, the lives you change. That's what makes a person immortal." As darkness began to claim the sky, they gathered around a simple camping lantern, sharing hot chocolate from mismatched mugs while the stars emerged like diamonds scattered across black velvet. The contrast between this humble gathering and the elaborate dinner parties Aurora was accustomed to couldn't have been starker, yet she had never felt more at home. "I have a poem," Isabela announced, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never doubted that her words mattered. "I made it up today." She cleared her throat with theatrical importance and began. "Money can buy a house, but not a home. It can buy a bed, but not sleep. It can buy companions, but not friends. It can buy pleasure, but not joy. But love is free and richer than all the gold in the world." The words hung in the air like a benediction, and Aurora felt tears streaming down her face. "Where'd you learn to be so wise?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "From Daddy," Isabela said simply. "And from Abuelo's stories. And from you." "From me?" Aurora asked, surprised. "You came here," Isabela said, her dark eyes serious. "Even though you're scared. Even though your fancy family probably told you not to. That's wisdom too." Aurora looked around at the simple garage, at the man who had risked everything to save her, at the child who saw the world with clarity that her billions couldn't buy. "I was lost," she admitted. "After the accident, after everything with the media, I didn't know where I belonged anymore." Marcos pointed up at the stars, visible despite the city lights, because they were so bright, so determined to shine. "See those stars? They don't belong to anyone. They're not rich or poor, they don't have titles or trust funds. They just are. And they're beautiful because they're themselves. The sky belongs to all of us," Isabela added, her voice filled with the kind of certainty that comes from deep truth. "Rich people and poor people, and everyone in between, we all see the same stars." Without a word, Aurora removed her platinum watch, the one her father had given her, the one that cost more than most people's cars, and placed it in Isabela's small hands. "I want you to have this," she said. "Not because it's expensive, but because time means something different now. Because of you." The silence that followed was profound, filled with understanding that transcended words. Marcos wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his composure finally cracking in the face of such unexpected generosity. "I can't accept this," he said, but Aurora shook her head. "It's not for you," she said gently. "It's for her. And it's not about the money. It's about marking this moment. About remembering that some things are more valuable than gold." As if summoned by some invisible signal, the community began to arrive. First came Professor Martinez from the local school, his arms full of books and his eyes bright with respect. "I heard about what you did," he said to Marcos. "The whole neighborhood's talking about it. You're a hero, my friend." Then came the shopkeepers, Mrs. Chun from the corner market bringing fresh fruit, Carlos the baker with bread still warm from the oven, Maria the florist, her arms full of simple wildflowers that smelled like hope itself. "This is for you," Maria said, presenting Aurora with a small bouquet. "From all of us. Thank you for bringing our Marcos back to us safe." Aurora accepted the flowers with hands that shook from emotion. In all her years of charity galas and philanthropic events, she had never felt the genuine warmth of community like this. These people had so little, yet they gave so freely, their gifts carrying the weight of real affection rather than social obligation. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, but Dona Rosa took her hands in her weathered ones. "Mija," the old woman said, her voice gentle but firm, "deserving has nothing to do with it. This is what family does for family. And you are family now." As the evening wound down and the neighbors began to drift back to their homes, Aurora felt something she had never experienced before, the bone-deep satisfaction of belonging somewhere, of being valued not for what she owned, but for who she was choosing to become. "Will you come back?" Isabela asked as Aurora prepared to leave, her small face hopeful in the lantern light. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Aurora promised, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As Marcos began to close up the garage, securing tools and switching off lights, Aurora realized that something fundamental had shifted. The bridges between their worlds, bridges built of kindness and understanding and simple human connection, were no longer fragile constructions that might collapse at the first sign of trouble. They were foundations now, strong enough to support whatever might come next. The garage doors closed with a metallic whisper, but the connections forged inside remained open, pathways of hope spanning the vast distance between two very different worlds, proving that some chasms could be crossed with nothing more than courage and an open heart. The ancient mansion loomed against the crimson sky like a cathedral of forgotten dreams, its Gothic spires piercing the heavens with accusations unspoken. Aurora's footsteps echoed through the grand foyer, each marble tile beneath her feet a testament to generations of Blackwood ambition. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of legacy, thick with the perfume of old money and older secrets. Portraits lined the endless corridors like sentinels of the past, stern-faced ancestors whose eyes followed her with silent judgment. Their gilded frames caught the dying light, creating an eerie procession of ghosts that had never truly left these hallowed halls. The mansion breathed with a life of its own, sighing through its ancient bones, whispering tales of power and privilege that had shaped her bloodline for centuries. Here in these very corridors, a young Aurora had once been a phantom child, racing through empty salons with laughter that echoed off marble walls and found no warmth in return. She remembered the suffocating loneliness of grand staircases that led to nowhere, of drawing rooms where conversation died the moment she entered. Even as a child, she had felt the terrible weight of displacement, a princess in a tower built not for protection, but for isolation. The memories crashed over her like waves against a crumbling shore. Birthday parties with hired entertainment, but no real friends. Christmas mornings in rooms so vast that even the most elaborate trees seemed small and insignificant. The constant presence of tutors, nannies, and staff who spoke to her with practiced deference but never genuine affection. She had grown up surrounded by everything money could buy, yet starved for the one thing it couldn't: authentic human connection. "Miss Aurora," came the razor-sharp voice of Ms. Whitman, her heels clicking against the floor with the precision of a metronome. The woman materialized from the shadows like a specter of propriety, her expression as rigid as the marble statues that adorn the halls. We simply must revise your diary entries before they reach the public eye. These vulnerabilities you've so carelessly expressed are hardly befitting of your station. The Blackwood name demands a certain refinement of truth. Each word was a surgical strike designed to carve away the rough edges of Aurora's humanity until only a polished facade remained. Ms. Whitman's eyes gleamed with the fervor of a zealot, her mission clear: to transform Aurora's authentic voice into something more palatable for public consumption, to sanitize her pain until it became merely another piece of carefully orchestrated publicity. But the universe, it seemed, had conspired against such calculated deception. The massive oak doors burst open with the drama of a thunderclap, and there stood Marcos like a knight-errant from another realm entirely. His arms overflowed with wildflowers from a community garden, humble blooms that carried more genuine beauty than all the imported orchids that decorated the mansion's countless vases. Beside him, young Isabela's dark eyes sparkled with wonder as she took in the opulent surroundings, her presence a living reminder of the vibrant world that existed beyond these gilded walls. The tension in the air was electric, crackling with the friction of two worlds colliding. Aurora's security detail, men trained to view everyone as a potential threat, exchanged wary glances with the local residents who had accompanied Marcos. Their suspicion was palpable, a toxic cloud that threatened to poison this moment of connection. Class warfare played out in silent stares and defensive postures, each side sizing up the other with the wariness of natural enemies. "Come," Aurora whispered to Marcos, her voice barely audible above the thundering of her own heart. She led him through a labyrinth of corridors, past rooms that held the ghosts of 1,000 lonely nights, until they reached her childhood sanctuary, an abandoned ballroom where crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears, and dust motes danced in shafts of golden sunlight that streamed through towering windows. "This was my secret kingdom," she confessed, her voice trembling with the vulnerability of a soul laid bare. The ballroom had been her refuge from the suffocating expectations of her birthright, a place where she could dream of being ordinary, of being loved for who she was rather than what she represented. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of grand parties that had never been thrown, Aurora poured out her deepest fears like wine from a broken chalice. The crushing weight of expectations that threatened to shatter her spirit, the paralyzing terror of failing to live up to a legacy that felt more like a curse than a blessing. Every word was a confession, every sentence a prayer for absolution from the sins of her bloodline. Marcos listened with the patience of a saint, his presence a lighthouse in her storm of self-doubt. His calloused hands, weathered by honest work, reached for her trembling fingers, a bridge between their worlds that no amount of wealth could purchase. As if summoned by destiny itself, Isabela's small fingers discovered a photograph that had fallen to the dust-covered floor, a faded image of Aurora as a child, standing beside her father in this very room. In that moment, his voice echoed across the years like a benediction. "You are more than my legacy, my darling. You are your own light." Marcos squeezed Aurora's hand gently, his touch both anchor and promise. "The past is a lesson, not a prison," he whispered as moonlight streamed through ancient windows, illuminating a future they would write together, one truth at a time. Chapter 7: Voices of Truth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as Aurora's trembling fingers scrolled through her phone, each headline a dagger thrust into her already wounded heart. "Billionaire Heiress slumming it," screamed one tabloid. Aurora's desperate grab for attention declared another. The local media had transformed her genuine quest for connection into a circus of sensationalism, twisting her vulnerability into a weapon of mass destruction against her very soul. The comments section beneath each article was a cesspool of cruelty, anonymous voices hurling poison with the reckless abandon of cowards hiding behind screens. "Spoiled rich girl playing with real people's lives," one read. "Just another publicity stunt," sneered another. Each word was a stone thrown at her glass heart, shattering her resolve piece by agonizing piece. The weight of exposure pressed down upon her like a mountain of judgment, threatening to crush what remained of her fragile courage. Meanwhile, in the sanctuary of Marcos's workshop, the air was thick with the aroma of hope and healing. Isabela's small hands worked beside his weathered ones, kneading dough for empanadas with the focused intensity of a child who understood that cooking was love made tangible. The rhythmic motion of their shared labor created a bubble of peace in the storm of media chaos, their quiet conversation a balm against the harsh realities of the outside world. "Will Aurora be okay?" Isabela whispered, her dark eyes filled with worry that seemed far too mature for her tender years. Marcos paused in his work, flour dusting his strong hands like snow, and pulled her close. "She's stronger than she knows, Mija. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who cry the most because they feel everything so deeply." It was then that Aurora discovered it, a simple note stapled to her mansion's imposing oak door, its message scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Tell your real story. We're listening." The words pierced through her despair like a shaft of sunlight through storm clouds, igniting a flame of determination that no amount of negative press could extinguish. Within hours, Aurora stood in the heart of the community square, her designer clothes exchanged for simple jeans and a cotton blouse that belonged more to the woman she was becoming than the heiress she had been born to be. The makeshift podium was nothing more than a wooden crate, but it felt more substantial than any corporate boardroom she had ever known. "Who wants to hear the truth?" she called out, her voice carrying across the square like a battle cry. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors emerged from their homes, shop owners closed their doors to gather around, children stopped their games to listen with wide-eyed curiosity. The silence that followed was not empty but full, pregnant with the possibility of genuine connection. Aurora's words flowed like a river breaking through a dam, carrying with them the sediment of years of suppressed emotion. She spoke of her father, not the titan of industry the world knew, but the man who had tucked her into bed with stories of knights and dragons, who had taught her that money was merely a tool, never an end in itself. She described the suffocating loneliness of growing up in a palace where every relationship was transactional, where affection came with price tags and love was a luxury she could never quite afford. "I've had everything money can buy," she confessed, tears streaming down her face like diamonds in the afternoon light, "but I've never had what you have here, a place where I belong, where I'm valued for who I am, not what I own." Marcos stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes glistening with unshed tears as he witnessed her transformation from wounded heiress to courageous truth-teller. The audience responded with thunderous applause that echoed off the surrounding buildings, a sound that seemed to heal something fundamental in Aurora's fractured soul. An ambitious journalist pushed forward, his recorder extended like a weapon, ready to turn her pain into profit. But the community formed a protective circle around Aurora, their silent solidarity more powerful than any security detail money could hire. The reporter retreated, defeated by the simple power of human decency. Young Isabela stepped forward, her small voice clear as a bell as she read from a crumpled piece of paper, "Family isn't who you're born to, but who you choose to love. And love isn't about having the same blood, it's about sharing the same heart." Aurora's composure finally cracked completely as she remembered the lake, the weight of her soaked dress dragging her down, the moment when she had chosen life over despair. "That dress," she whispered, "it was my shroud. But you, all of you, you've given me wings." As night fell, an impromptu bonfire crackled in the square, its orange flames dancing against the darkening sky like spirits of hope made visible. Neighbors shared stories, children roasted marshmallows, and for the first time in her life, Aurora felt the warmth of belonging. Colombo, her childhood friend, emerged from the shadows carrying a weathered photograph. "Your grandfather once told me," he said softly, "that the truth doesn't just set you free, it makes you whole." As the crowd dispersed into the peaceful night, Aurora remained by the dying fire, finally understanding that the greatest wealth wasn't in her trust fund, but in the hearts that had opened to embrace her broken, authentic self. The mansion's grand doors slammed shut behind Aurora with the finality of a tomb sealing, the sound reverberating through marble halls that suddenly felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Her family's advisors waited in the drawing room like vultures circling carrion, their expensive suits and calculated expressions a stark contrast to the warmth she had just left behind in the community square. "Aurora, what you've done is unprecedented," her Uncle Charles declared, his voice dripping with the kind of disdain reserved for those who dared to color outside the lines of inherited privilege. The mahogany table between them might as well have been a chasm, separating two worlds that seemed increasingly incompatible with each passing moment. But Aurora's voice, when it came, carried the strength of 1,000 supportive voices that had embraced her truth. "I've found something more valuable than all our portfolios combined," she said, her words cutting through the suffocating atmosphere like a blade of light. "I've found people who see me, not my bank account." The debate that followed was a tempest of conflicting philosophies, the old guard clinging to their fortress of appearances while Aurora advocated for the revolutionary concept of genuine human connection. Voices rose and fell like waves against a crumbling shore, each argument a brick in the wall that was slowly building between Aurora and the life she had always known. Meanwhile, in the vibrant heart of the community, Marcos extended an invitation that would prove to be a bridge between worlds. "Come see where real education happens," he said, his eyes twinkling with the kind of mischief that suggested miracles were about to unfold. The local school was a modest building, its walls painted in colors that seemed to glow with the dreams of children who understood that hope was not a luxury, but a necessity. Isabela's small hand slipped into Aurora's as they entered the art classroom, where paint-stained smocks hung like colorful prayers and creativity bloomed in every corner. The teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, greeted Aurora not as a celebrity, but as a friend of Isabela's, her warm smile immediately dissolving any pretense or formality. "Today we're learning to sketch hope," Mrs. Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying the kind of wisdom that comes from years of nurturing young souls. The children's faces lit up with the intensity of small suns, their pencils moving across paper with the confidence of artists who had never been told their dreams were impossible. As Aurora watched, mesmerized, the children began creating portraits that captured something beautiful and profound, drawings of herself, Marcos, and Isabela standing together, their faces radiant with joy. In these innocent sketches, she saw herself not as the troubled heiress the tabloids portrayed, but as someone worthy of love and belonging. The workshop they organized that afternoon was nothing short of magical. Neighbors arrived with broken toys, their children clutching damaged treasures with the kind of hope that only the young possess. Aurora's manicured hands worked alongside Marcos's calloused ones, gluing wings back onto toy airplanes and mending the stuffed animals that had seen too many adventures. "You know," said David, a young lawyer who had quietly observed the proceedings, "I've been working for your family's firm for years, but I've never seen anything as important as this." His offer to provide legal support pro bono was a crack in the wall of corporate indifference, a sign that even within the castle walls, hearts could be changed. The conversation that followed was raw and honest, stripping away the protective layers they had both built around their wounded souls. "I've been afraid to trust," Aurora admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every relationship in my life has come with conditions, with expectations. I don't know how to just be." Marcos's response was gentle but firm. "Trust isn't about guarantees, Aurora. It's about choosing to believe in something beautiful, even when you can't see the whole picture." As evening approached, Isabela's voice rose in song, her words weaving a spell of unity that seemed to transform the very air around them. "We are all flowers in the same garden, drinking from the same rain, reaching for the same sun." The community gathered in a circle, their voices joining hers in a harmony that transcended social boundaries and economic divides. The mural they painted together on the workshop's exterior wall became a testament to their shared vision, hands of every age and color intertwined in a rainbow of possibility. Aurora's cousin Richard arrived with sabotage in mind, but found himself disarmed by the sheer power of collective joy, his cynicism melting away like snow in spring sunshine. That night, as Aurora sat on Marcos's small porch, a simple lantern casting dancing shadows across their faces, she read aloud from letters written by elderly neighbors. Each word was a benediction, a reminder that dignity was not something money could buy, but something communities could restore. "When we forgive," Marcos said softly, his voice carrying the wisdom of his grandfather's memory, "we don't just heal the past, we build bridges to the future." The murals stood complete as dawn broke over the community, its message clear and eternal. In a world that often tried to divide them, they had chosen to unite. The sun's rays caught the painted hands, making them seem to glow with promise, announcing that reconciliation was not just possible, but inevitable when hearts chose love over fear. Chapter 9. The Media's Judgment. The fluorescent lights of the television studio blazed with the cold intensity of an interrogation chamber as the sensationalist program's host, Miranda Sterling, adjusted her predatory smile for the cameras. Her voice dripped with manufactured concern as she introduced the evening's topic, Aurora Blackwood's inappropriate relationship, a billionaire's dangerous liaison or genuine love. The panel of so-called experts, a parade of talking heads who had never met Aurora but felt qualified to dissect her heart, settled into their chairs like judges preparing to deliver a verdict on matters they could never truly comprehend. Miles away, in the sanctuary of her childhood bedroom, Aurora sat cross-legged on her Persian rug, surrounded by the ghosts of innocence, dusty teddy bears that had once been her only confidants, photo albums chronicling birthday parties where smiles were purchased rather than earned, and diaries filled with the lonely musings of a girl who had everything except what mattered most. The television screen glowed like a malevolent eye, broadcasting a trial where she was both defendant and evidence, where her authentic emotions were being reduced to sound bites and scandal. Is it appropriate for someone of Ms. Blackwood's standing to involve herself so intimately with the working class? Sneered Dr. Hamilton, a social psychologist whose cold analysis cut through the air like scalpel. There are clear power dynamics at play here that raise serious ethical questions. Aurora's hands trembled as she reached for the remote, her heart fracturing with each calculated word. The internal dialogue that had been haunting her for days crescendoed into a symphony of self-doubt. Have I been naive? Have I endangered everyone I care about by bringing these two worlds together? What if they're right? What if my love is just another form of privilege, another way I'm unconsciously exploiting those who have less? Meanwhile, in the warm embrace of Marcos's modest kitchen, the aroma of chocolate and cinnamon created a protective cocoon against the harsh realities of the outside world. His weathered hands moved with practiced grace as he stirred the pot of hot chocolate, the wooden spoon making lazy circles that seemed to hypnotize young Isabela, who sat perched on the counter like a small guardian angel. "Tio Marcos," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle bubbling of the chocolate. "Why are they saying mean things about Aurora? She's not mean. She helped me fix my doll." Marcos paused in his stirring, his dark eyes reflecting the pain of a man who had watched too many good things be twisted into weapons. Sometimes, Mija, people are afraid of what they don't understand. And love, real love, is the most frightening thing of all because it changes everything. The response came like a thunderclap of righteousness from a most unexpected source. The students of the local elementary school, armed with poster boards and crayons, had organized themselves into a small but mighty army of truth-tellers. They marched toward the television studio with the determined steps of children who had never been taught that their voices didn't matter, their colorful banners fluttering in the morning breeze like flags of hope. "Love doesn't know titles," proclaimed one sign, painted in rainbow letters that seemed to dance in the sunlight. "Family is who you choose," declared another, held high by a boy whose gap-toothed grin radiated the kind of wisdom that only comes from a heart that has never learned to hate. The image of these children, Aurora's children now, in every way that mattered, standing in peaceful protest against the machinery of cynicism, shattered something fundamental in Aurora's chest. She felt the familiar surge of courage that had carried her through every dark moment of her life, the same strength that had pulled her from the depths of that lake and into the light of authentic living. With hands that shook but held steady purpose, Aurora positioned her phone and began to record. The words that poured from her lips were not polished or calculated. They were raw, honest, and devastatingly beautiful. "I've lived my entire life in a golden cage," she said, her voice cracking with emotion, surrounded by people who told me what I should want, what I should feel, what I should be. But Marcos and Isabela, they didn't see my bank account. They saw my heart. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was enough, exactly as I am. The video exploded across social media like wildfire, reaching millions of screens in a matter of hours. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages of support flooded in from single mothers who recognized the loneliness in Aurora's eyes, from immigrants who understood Marcos's quiet dignity, from children who saw in Isabela their own capacity for unconditional love. But the backlash was equally fierce. Conservative commentators denounced her as a bleeding heart liberal playing dress-up, while others accused her of exploiting the poor for publicity. The comment sections became battlegrounds where anonymous warriors fought proxy wars over the nature of love, class, and authenticity. Then came the call that would change everything. James Morrison, the most respected journalist in the nation, a man whose integrity was legendary and whose empathy was genuine, requested a live interview. As Aurora sat across from him in the studio's softer lighting, she felt the weight of a million watching eyes, but also the strength of knowing that truth had a power all its own. "Tell me about love," Morrison said simply, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that invited honesty rather than demanded it. Aurora's response was interrupted by a sight that stopped her heart mid-sentence. There, in the studio doorway, stood Marcos with Isabela in his arms, both of them having traveled across the city to stand beside her in this moment of judgment. The cameras captured all, the way Aurora's face transformed from anxiety to pure joy, the way Marcos's presence seemed to anchor her to something real and solid, the way Isabela's small hand reached out to touch Aurora's face with the tender concern of a child who loved without conditions. "This," Aurora whispered, her voice breaking as she took Marcos's trembling hand in hers, "this is what wealth really looks like. Not the numbers in my account, but the love in this child's eyes. Money can't buy what they've given me. A family, a purpose, a reason to be better than I ever thought possible." The image became iconic within hours. 3 people of different backgrounds, united not by circumstance but by choice, their joined hands telling a story that no amount of criticism could diminish. Aurora's announcement that she would be donating significant portions of her inheritance to underfunded schools sent shockwaves through both the media and the financial world. The small business owners of the community found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their stories of daily generosity and mutual support becoming symbols of a different kind of wealth. Mrs. Chun, who had been feeding neighborhood children for years, suddenly found herself on magazine covers. Mr. Rodriguez, whose repair shop had become a gathering place for anyone needing help, was invited to speak at conferences about community building. As the media circus swirled around them, Marcos pulled Aurora close in the quiet of her mansion's garden, his voice steady and sure. "The media shows what sells me more. But we live what we are. And what we are is real, no matter what anyone else says." The campaign that emerged from their story was organic and powerful. Donations poured in from ordinary people who had been touched by their authentic connection. Teachers, factory workers, retirees on fixed incomes, all contributing what they could to create something beautiful and lasting. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Aurora and Marcos stood hand in hand at the mansion's great window, watching the world transform around them. They had survived the judgment of the media, the criticism of the masses, and the weight of public scrutiny. But more than that, they had discovered that true love, the kind that builds bridges instead of walls, was stronger than any force that sought to tear it down. In the distance, the lights of the community began to twinkle like earthbound stars, each one representing a life touched by their courage to love across the boundaries that society had tried to build. They had faced the storm and emerged not unscathed but unbroken, their bond forged stronger by the fire of public opinion and tempered by the truth of their own hearts. The ancient wing of the mansion had always been Aurora's sanctuary, a place where dust motes danced in shafts of golden light and forgotten memories whispered from every corner. Tonight, however, it would serve a different purpose, as the stage for a moment that would forever alter the trajectory of 3 intertwined lives. The mahogany table, polished to mirror perfection, reflected not just the flickering candlelight, but the hopes and dreams of souls who had found each other across the vast chasm of social division. Aurora's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the simple place settings, each piece carefully chosen not for its monetary value, but for its ability to tell a story. The plates had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had understood that true elegance lay not in ostentation, but in the warmth of genuine hospitality. The silverware bore the patina of countless family meals from an era when the Blackwood name had meant community rather than isolation. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air like a prayer answered, each loaf shaped by Donna Rose's weathered hands with the kind of love that could only come from a lifetime of nurturing others. The elderly woman had appeared at Aurora's door that morning, her arms full of ingredients and her heart full of determination to create something beautiful for this pivotal evening. "Me Nina," she had said, her voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through decades of struggle and triumph. "Bread is more than food, is the foundation upon which families are built." Her gnarled fingers had worked the dough with the reverence of a sculptor creating a masterpiece, each need a benediction, each fold a promise of sustenance for both body and soul. The herbal tea that Aurora prepared came from her own grandmother's garden, dried leaves that had waited patiently in mason jars for a moment worthy of their healing properties. Chamomile for peace, mint for clarity, and lavender for love, a blend that seemed to carry the essence of generations of women who had understood that true medicine came from the earth and the heart. When Marcos arrived with Isabela, their faces glowing with the kind of anticipation that only comes from knowing you are truly wanted, Aurora felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the iron bands that had constricted her heart for so many years. "I never thought I'd find peace in a world different from my own," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle crackling of the fireplace. "But here, with you, I've found something I didn't even know I was searching for." Isabela's response was immediate and profound. She produced a large piece of poster board from her backpack, unfurling it with the dramatic flair of a magician revealing her greatest trick. The drawing that covered its surface was a testament to the power of innocent perception. All of them together, their faces radiating joy with the kind of pure happiness that could only be captured through a child's unfiltered vision. In her artistic interpretation, there were no class distinctions, no social barriers, only a family united by choice and love. "I have something to show you," Aurora said, her voice thick with emotion as she led them through corridors that had witnessed generations of Blackwood history. The old library, with its towering shelves and leather-bound volumes, had been transformed into something magical, a space where community and knowledge would intersect, where children from a neighborhood could discover worlds beyond their circumstances, while adults found resources to build better lives. Marcos stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes taking in the carefully arranged toys that had been lovingly repaired, the books that had been rescued from dusty neglect, the reading nooks that had been created with small hands and big dreams in mind. His composure cracked like a dam under pressure, tears streaming down his face as he realized the magnitude of what Aurora had created. Not just a community center, but a temple to the possibility of transformation. The moment was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Charles, Aurora's uncle, who had arrived with shoulders bent under the weight of regret and eyes that spoke of a man who had finally seen the error of his ways. His apology, when it came, was raw and genuine, stripped of the polished rhetoric that had defined his professional life. "I was wrong," he said simply, his voice cracking with the vulnerability of a man who had spent years building walls only to discover they had become his prison. "I let fear drive me to cruelty, and I'm sorry to all of you." Aurora's response was immediate and transformative. Strength isn't holding on to anger, Uncle Charles. It's having the courage to let it go and build something better. The embrace that followed was healing not just for them, but for everyone who witnessed it, a reminder that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to seek it. As volunteers began arriving to help with the center's renovation, the ancient walls seemed to pulse with new life. Children's voices echoed through corridors that had been silent for too long, their laughter a symphony of hope that reverberated through every room. Small hands dipped paintbrushes in bright colors, creating murals that proclaimed, "Here is home for everyone," in languages that represented the beautiful diversity of their community. The symbolic moment came when Aurora placed the ornate brass key to the center in Isabela's small palm, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "This belongs to all of us now," she whispered, "but you, sweet girl, you're the heart that will keep it beating." As afternoon melted into evening, the ancient stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across the renovated space, each colored beam seeming to bless the work that had been accomplished. Marcos pulled Aurora aside, his voice heavy with the weight of profound realization. Building trust isn't about grand gestures, it's about planting roots so deep that storms can't shake them. The corridors that had once displayed only portraits of long-dead Blackwood ancestors now showcased a different kind of legacy. Photographs of both families intermingled, creating a tapestry that spoke of chosen family and intentional love. The visual representation of their union was more powerful than any legal document, more binding than any contract. As darkness fell, they gathered in a circle on the floor of the main room, the flickering candlelight creating an atmosphere of sacred intimacy. Stories were shared, dreams were voiced, and plans were made for a future that none of them could have imagined just months before. "It's like a real fairy tale," Isabela whispered, her voice filled with the wonder of a child who had discovered that magic was real and lived in the space between hearts that had chosen to love. Aurora smiled through her tears, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had finally found her purpose. "The real luxury isn't what we own, it's knowing we belong to each other." As the curtains were drawn and the lights dimmed in the new community center, the promise of tomorrow hung in the air like a benediction. They had built more than a building. They had constructed a bridge between worlds, a foundation for a future where love would always triumph over fear, where trust would grow like roots that nothing could break. The dusty attic of the Blackwood mansion held secrets like a tomb holds bones, ancient, forgotten, and somehow still pulsing with the life they had once contained. Aurora's fingers trembled as she sifted through cardboard boxes that had been sealed for decades, each one a time capsule of a family's carefully curated history. The envelope, she discovered, was tucked between yellowed stock certificates and faded photographs, its wax seal bearing the distinctive crest of her grandfather's personal correspondence. The parchment crackled like autumn leaves as she carefully opened it, revealing handwriting that belonged to a man she had only known through portraits and posthumous reverence. But these words, written in her father's desperate scrawl, told a story that shattered every assumption she had ever held about her family's pristine legacy. "My dearest father," the letter began, "I write this knowing I may never find the courage to deliver it. The woman I abandoned, Isabela's mother, she deserved better than the coward I became. I chose wealth over love, duty over heart, and now I live with the weight of that choice every day." If you're reading this, then perhaps Aurora will understand that sometimes the greatest inheritance we leave isn't money, but the courage to love without condition. Miles away, in the warmth of his cluttered workshop, Marcos made his own discovery. Hidden beneath layers of rust and neglect, wedged between forgotten tools and discarded metal, lay an intricate brass gear, a masterpiece of engineering that bore the unmistakable mark of his grandfather's craftsmanship. The metal seemed to pulse with memory as he cleaned it, each careful stroke of his cloth revealing engravings that spoke of a man who had believed that persistence could move mountains. "Tio Marcos," Isabela's voice cut through his reverie like a bell through morning mist. "Do you think there are secrets that change people forever?" Her dark eyes held the kind of wisdom that sometimes visits children unexpectedly, as if the universe had whispered profound truths directly into their innocent souls. When Aurora arrived at the workshop, her father's letter clutched against her chest like a shield. She found Marcos polishing the ancient gear with the tenderness of someone handling a holy relic. The convergence of their discoveries felt orchestrated by forces beyond their understanding. Two families, two legacies, two pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across generations. "Sometimes we carry the weight of others' mistakes," Aurora whispered as she read the letter aloud, her voice breaking with each confession her father had been too proud to make in life. But maybe that's not a burden. Maybe it's a chance to heal what they couldn't. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who had initially viewed Aurora with suspicion now surrounded her with protective warmth, their voices rising in a chorus of support. Mrs. Chun brought tea and wisdom. "Truth is like sunlight. It shows us the cracks, but it also helps us grow." Mr. Rodriguez nodded solemnly. "The foundation of reconciliation is built on honesty, Mija. Your father's pain doesn't define you, but how you honor it will." The confrontation with Ms. Whitman was swift and decisive. The woman arrived at the workshop like a storm cloud, her perfectly pressed suit and calculating smile a stark contrast to the authentic warmth that now surrounded Aurora. "Miss Blackwood, we need to discuss damage control. This letter cannot see the light of day." But Aurora's response carried the quiet strength of someone who had finally found her voice. "Ms. Whitman, I won't need your services anymore. I've learned that the only reputation worth protecting is one built on truth." The dismissal was delivered with such serene finality that even the formidable Ms. Whitman had no choice but to retreat, her empire of manufactured narratives crumbling in the face of authentic courage. The media coverage that followed was unprecedented in its respectful tone. "Emotional inheritance brought to light," read the headline of the city's most respected newspaper, while television anchors spoke in hushed tones about the courage required to expose family secrets for the greater good of healing. It was Marcos who made the connection, his weathered fingers tracing the faded blueprints tucked within the letter's pages. "Aurora, look at this. Your grandfather wasn't just a businessman, he was a dreamer. This project, it's exactly what we've been trying to build." The social initiative outlined in the yellowed papers was breathtaking in its scope and vision, a network of community centers, educational programs, and economic development projects designed to bridge the gap between privilege and need. It had been abandoned upon the grandfather's death, another casualty of family grief and corporate priorities. Isabela's artistic interpretation of their mission took the form of a simple but powerful logo, two hands clasped together, surrounded by interlocking gears that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of shared purpose. "It's like the gear from your grandfather and the love from ours," she explained, her small fingers tracing the design with the confidence of someone who understood that symbols could carry more weight than words. The first meeting between Aurora's affluent connections and Marcos's community was electric with possibility. The mansion's grand ballroom, transformed into a collaborative workspace, buzzed with conversations that would have been impossible just months before. Small business owners shared tables with investment bankers, teachers brainstormed with economists, and children played in corners while adults reimagined the future. "Educational workshops," proposed Mrs. Torres, her calloused hands sketching ideas on napkins. "We teach what we know, cooking, repair work, budgeting, while learning what we need." The proposal was met with enthusiastic nods from both sides of the economic divide, each person recognizing their unique contribution to a larger tapestry. As the evening deepened into night, Aurora found herself in the garden with Marcos, the ancient gear turning slowly in his hands as they walked among roses that bloomed despite the approaching autumn. "I used to think legacy was about preserving the past," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the gentle splash of the fountain. "But maybe it's about transforming lives, starting with our own." Marcos's response was immediate and profound. "Forgiveness doesn't just heal old wounds, it opens pathways we never knew existed. Your father's regret becomes your opportunity." Your grandfather's dream becomes our reality. The planning session that followed was a symphony of collaboration. Coffee grew cold as ideas flowed hot. Laughter punctuated serious discussions, and tentative friendships blossomed across social boundaries that had seemed insurmountable just hours before. Aurora watched it all with the wonder of someone witnessing a miracle, her heart swelling with the recognition that this beautiful chaos of human connection was what wealth was truly meant to create. Later, alone in her father's study, Aurora placed the letter in a glass case beside the restored gear, creating a shrine to the power of truth and the possibility of redemption. The moonlight caught the brass surface, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper promises of a future where love would always triumph over fear. As dawn broke over the city, the first rays of sunlight struck the gear in Aurora's hands, its polished surface reflecting not just light, but hope itself. The past had been acknowledged, the present embraced, and the future, their future, stretched before them like an endless horizon of possibility. The mahogany boardroom stretched before Aurora like a battlefield draped in expensive leather and polished silence. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below, a kingdom of glass and steel that had once felt like her domain, now seeming as fragile as spun sugar. The social project that had ignited her soul like wildfire now drew the predatory gaze of Aurora's corporate council, their eyes glinting with the cold calculation of vultures circling wounded prey. Immediate returns, the words slithered from the lips of investors who had forgotten that money was meant to serve humanity, not devour it. Their voices rose in a crescendo of greed, demanding profits that could be counted in dollars rather than transformed lives. The quarterly reports lay scattered across the table like accusations, each number a dagger aimed at the heart of her vision. In the suffocating atmosphere of corporate ambition, Marcos stood at the crossroads of his own soul, his weathered hands trembling as he confronted Aurora with the question that would haunt them both. How far are we willing to go to fight for what we believe in? His voice cracked like autumn leaves, carrying the weight of a community's hopes and the bitter taste of potential betrayal. But it was Isabela, sweet, innocent Isabela, who cut through the labyrinth of adult complications with the razor-sharp clarity of childhood wisdom. "Happiness is when everyone gets their turn," she announced, her small voice echoing through the mansion's corridors like a prayer made manifest. In those simple words lay the blueprint for a revolution that no boardroom could contain. The confrontation arrived like a thunderstorm that had been brewing for decades. Aurora faced her counsel in a meeting that crackled with tension, so thick it could have been sliced with a knife. The air tasted of expensive cologne and desperation as she defended priorities that placed human hearts above profit margins. Her voice rose and fell like a symphony of conviction, each word a bullet fired at the fortress of indifference. Her adversaries, once allies who had shared champagne toasts to mutual success, now transformed into enemies wielding spreadsheets like weapons. "There's no financial return," they declared with the finality of judges pronouncing sentence, their proposal to cut funding hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. From Marcos's community came an avalanche of support that shattered the corporate armor surrounding Aurora's heart. Videos arrived like love letters from the forgotten, each testimonial a brushstroke painting hope across the canvas of despair. Letters penned in careful handwriting told stories of transformation that no quarterly report could capture. "The profit in the heart cannot be measured in balance sheets," Aurora declared, her words ringing through the boardroom like church bells announcing resurrection. The phrase became her battle cry, a banner under which the wounded could rally. In a twist that would have made Shakespeare weep, Miss Whitman, the Ice Queen who had once stood as Aurora's greatest nemesis, approached with the humility of a penitent pilgrim. Her offer to help reorganize the plan came wrapped in genuine remorse, her voice stripped of its former venom and replaced with something achingly human. The miracle manifested in the form of a single investor, his heart cracked open by Isabela's testimony like a safe whose combination had finally been discovered. His change of mind rippled through the financial world like a stone thrown into still water, creating circles of influence that would expand far beyond their origins. The press descended like hungry angels, their cameras capturing the moment when David faced Goliath in pinstripe suits. National sympathy flowed like a river breaking its banks, washing away the cynicism that had calcified around the public heart. In the garden of Aurora's mansion, where roses had once bloomed in solitude, she and Marcos performed a ritual as old as hope itself. Together, they planted a rose bush, its roots drinking deep from soil enriched by tears and watered by dreams. The earth clung to their fingers like a blessing, promising beauty in seasons yet to come. "The greatest battles are fought within ourselves," Aurora whispered, her breath visible in the cool evening air. The words settled between them like a sacred truth, acknowledged and accepted. The community lunch that followed broke every rule of social stratification ever written. Rich and poor sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing empanadas and stories with the democracy of shared humanity. Aurora's tears fell freely as she tasted Dona Rosa's simple broth, a flavor that tasted like home, like belonging, like the childhood she had never been allowed to have. Marcos raised his glass, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy, to the union that transforms. Above them, seagulls danced attendance as lanterns rose into the twilight sky, their light ascending like prayers made visible. As darkness embraced the world with gentle arms, Aurora felt the ancient pain that had lived in her chest for decades finally begin to dissolve, replaced by something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. The rose bush, lovingly watered by Isabela's small hands, stood as a promise of flowers yet to bloom in tomorrow's garden. "The price of courage," Aurora murmured to the night, "is the freedom to be who we truly are." The morning arrived like a benediction, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose as the community center stood ready for its sacred unveiling. This was more than mere inauguration. It was the resurrection of Aurora's grandfather's dream, a phoenix rising from the ashes of forgotten promises. The building gleamed with fresh paint and hope, its windows reflecting not just light, but the faces of those who had dared to believe in second chances. Aurora's fingers trembled as she gripped the ancient scissors from Marcos's workshop, their worn handles smooth from decades of honest labor. The red ribbon stretched before her like a lifeline connecting her past to her future, each strand woven with the tears and laughter of a journey that had transformed her from a woman trapped in golden cages to one who had learned to fly on wings of compassion. "This center represents more than bricks and mortar," Aurora's voice carried across the gathered crowd like a hymn sung in a cathedral of dreams. "It stands as testament to love that transcends material possession, to wealth that cannot be counted in dollars, but in the warmth of human connection." Her words fell like gentle rain on soil long parched by indifference, each syllable nurturing seeds of hope in hearts that had forgotten how to bloom. Beside her, Marcos held Isabela's small hand, a gesture so simple yet profound that it spoke volumes about the courage found in choosing love over fear. His weathered palm, marked by years of honest work, cradled her delicate fingers like a precious butterfly that had finally found its way home. In that single touch lay the foundation of everything they had built together, every battle they had fought, every tear they had shed. The applause that erupted was not merely polite acknowledgement, but a thunderous ovation that shook the very foundations of social convention. Neighbors who had once whispered behind lace curtains now stood shoulder to shoulder with representatives of high society, their hands joined in appreciation for something beautiful that had emerged from the ashes of prejudice and misunderstanding. The ritual that followed was as sacred as any religious ceremony. Each participant approached the central garden bed like pilgrims visiting a shrine, their hands bearing flowers that would bloom long after this day had faded into memory. Rich and poor, young and old, each planted their offering in soil that had been blessed by tears of joy and watered by dreams finally realized. "You taught me that love doesn't need vaults to store it," Aurora whispered to Isabela, kneeling to meet the child's eyes. those windows to a soul that had remained pure despite the storms that had raged around her small world. The words hung in the air like prayer flags, carrying messages of gratitude to whatever gods watch over broken hearts learning to beat again. Marcos stood watching, his heart full to bursting as he reflected on the miracle of their transformation. "Now we are a family that chose to love each other," he murmured, his voice carrying the wonder of a man who had discovered treasure in the most unlikely places. The words tasted like freedom on his tongue, sweet and intoxicating. The photographs that captured this moment were not the carefully orchestrated images of Aurora's former life, but spontaneous snapshots of authentic joy, smiles that had not been rehearsed, laughter that bubbled up from wells of genuine happiness. These were the images that would grace their memory long after professional portraits had yellowed and faded. As evening painted the sky in watercolors of purple and orange, Aurora found herself in Marcos's workshop, her manicured hands working alongside his calloused ones to repair one of Isabela's beloved toys. The contrast was striking: silk and steel, perfume and motor oil, yet somehow perfectly harmonious. The scent of roses from the garden mingled with the honest smell of workshop oil, creating a perfume more precious than any designer fragrance. The full moon rose like a spotlight on their domestic theater, illuminating the scene as laughter echoed through the neighborhood like music composed by angels. In the silvery light, everything seemed touched by magic: the workshop, the garden, the faces of those who had dared to believe in love's power to transform. "We found wealth in what we never lost, our hearts," Aurora confessed to Marcos in the intimate darkness, her voice soft as butterfly wings. The words settled between them like a secret shared between lovers, a truth so profound it changed the very air they breathed. In her small hands, Isabela's artwork told the story better than any novelist could: a family united beneath a rainbow, their hands joined in eternal connection. Each crayon stroke was a prayer, each color a celebration of the love that had bloomed in most unlikely garden. The small merchants who had once viewed Aurora with suspicion now raised their cups of hot chocolate and toast, their empanadas shared like communion bread among those who had learned that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we give away. Aurora's voice, soft as morning mist, carried across the night. "Some things cannot be bought. A child's embrace, the smell of morning coffee, hands held when everything falls apart." The words floated like dandelion seeds on the evening breeze, carrying hope to corners of the world that had forgotten how to dream. In the privacy of his thoughts, Marcos smiled. She never needed a castle, she needed a home. The revelation struck him like lightning, illuminating everything they had built together with the clarity of absolute truth. As dawn approached, the camera of fate pulled back to reveal the rose bush they had planted together, its first blooms opening like promises kept, like prayers answered, like love finally finding its way home. The sun rose behind it, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility. The strongest love is the one chosen every day. Dear viewer, if this tale has touched your heart, like, share, and follow for more stories of second chances and true love.